Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to It's Rainmaking Time. This is Kim Greenhouse. It gives me great pleasure to welcome Daniel Matt, the leading authority on Jewish mysticism, who for over 20 years served as professor of Jewish spirituality at the Graduate Theological Union in Berkeley, California. He's also taught at Stanford University and the Hebrew University of Jerusalem. He's published 6 books, actually more now: The Essential Kabbalah, Zohar, the Book of Enlightenment, Zohar, Annotated and Explained, God in the Big Bang, Discovering Harmony Between Science and Spirituality. And I must say that he took on, I think, the biggest project of his life. He is translating Kabbalah directly from Aramaic. The book that he's translating is called the Zohar. Ladies and gentlemen, welcome Daniel Matt to It's Rainmaking Time. Good afternoon.
Good to be with you.
I'm very excited about what you're doing, and one part of me is perplexed at how you're doing 2 pages of Aramaic a week, translating 12 pages in English, commentary, reconstructing Aramaic. And how did you learn Aramaic?
I learned Aramaic gradually, really. My father was a rabbi, and I studied intensively with him, more Hebrew, I would say, the Bible and commentaries on the Bible in Hebrew. And then I began studying the Talmud, which is the main text of Rabbinic Judaism, written in Aramaic. And then the Zohar I discovered when I was about 19 years old. And I really delved into that, and gradually over the years I've learned to make sense of it.
You speak with such a calm and a poise about really the Jewish mysticism book. Isn't the Zohar, which means radiance and splendor, the book of Jewish mysticism?
Yes, I think it'd be good to start just distinguishing between Kabbalah and Zohar. Kabbalah is the name for the overall movement of Jewish mysticism, you might say. Literally, Kabbalah means receiving or tradition. So it's used to describe the whole Jewish mystical tradition from ancient roots up to modern times. But there is no book called the Kabbalah. Kabbalah, in other words, is a name for the whole philosophy of Jewish mysticism. The Zohar is the main text of the Kabbalah, and that's really how they relate to one another.
The way that you write, Daniel, is very poetic, and you remind me of the Sufis. You remind me of Rumi, the way you translate. Have you studied Rumi?
Yes, I find Rumi very powerful, and it's interesting because Rumi is an exact contemporary of the author of the Zohar. They both lived and wrote in the 13th century. There was certainly no direct contact between them, because Rumi is in Turkey and the Zohar is composed in Spain. But there were Sufis, of course, active in Spain, and there is some Islamic influence in the Zohar, Christian and Islamic influence, although certainly it's primarily a Jewish book. And Rumi is certainly, one of the great poetic and mystical geniuses of all time. And the Zohar is, I think, the great poetic book of Kabbalah.
I think what's also interesting is the way you talk about the Zohar, which is that it's also about this journey of these people, these rabbis through Galilee. It's a journey. It's a story. It's also a commentary.
Right. The Zohar is really at least 2 things simultaneously. On the one hand, it's a commentary on the 5 books of Moses, on the Torah, and certain other parts of the Bible. But it's at the same time a kind of mystical novel. It traces the journeys and the wanderings, as you said, of a circle of rabbis who are wandering through the hills of Galilee, sharing secrets of Torah, running into interesting characters on the road. For example, an old donkey driver who seems to be a total idiot, but turns out to be a great master of wisdom in disguise. Or a little child who pesters the rabbis with seemingly foolish questions, but it turns out this little child is also a real mystic sage. So it really goes back and forth between adventures of the rabbis on the road and their insights into different parts of the Torah, of the 5 books of Moses.
What do you think has caused the popularity of Kabbalah today?
I wonder about that a lot. It's really very interesting. When I began studying it, hardly anyone knew about it. people asked me what I did, and I said Kabbalah. No one knew what that meant. And now people on the street have heard of it because, of course, the Hollywood crowd, it's become famous in part because of that. I think there are a couple factors. One thing that attracts people to Kabbalah is that it's a unique kind of spirituality. You know, many spiritual systems demand that you reject the material world. They create a sharp dichotomy between the material and the spiritual. And Kabbalah insists that we integrate the spiritual and the material, that we not flee from the world, but try to engage the world and transform it. The challenge is to live in the world and to turn the mundane into the holy. So it's a way, you could say, it's a way to be spiritual and yet not reject the world. I think that appeals to people. And another element is that it's an exotic form of religion, and yet it's strangely familiar because it's based on the Bible. It's based on the foundational text of all Western culture. Even though it says many radical things, it's always beginning and coming back to specific verses in the Bible. For example, the very first verse in Genesis, in the beginning God created the heaven and the earth. The Zohar reads that very differently. Not in the beginning God created, but with beginning, the unnameable one created God. In other words, God turns out to be the object of the sentence rather than the subject. That sounds heretical. How can you say that God was created? But what the Zohar means is that there's really an infinite nature of God, known as Ein Sof, the infinite. And this infinity brought into being what we think of as God. In other words, our conception of God doesn't really stretch far enough. It doesn't encompass the ultimate reality of God. So for the Zohar, that you could say there's a God beyond God. That's actually a formulation that goes back to a great Christian mystic, Meister Eckhart. But the Zohar really would be very comfortable with that wording. There's a God beyond God, and we should try to get beyond our childish conceptions of God and be open to a more vast dimension.
Don't you think that's the most difficult part of relating spiritually, no matter where a person's from, is the concept of God gets in the way of the infusion from the divine?
Yes, certainly. Our ideas and our preconceptions get in the way. And the Zohar is struggling with that because the Zohar and the Kabbalah are very loyal to the tradition, and yet at the same time they're dissatisfied with the rote formulas and the rote ways of doing things. They insist that you experience the divine power, or as you said, the divine infusion. So they're reading the traditional texts, but constantly challenging us to scratch the surface, to go beneath the surface, to penetrate the outer layer of meaning, and to discover a more experiential core.
I want to speak more with you about this, but I want to clarify one thing at the beginning for listeners so you can be heard contextually. When you began this project to reconstruct Aramaic text based on original manuscripts, as you write, which you found in various libraries, mostly in Europe, and on microfilm in Jerusalem, when you say original manuscripts, can you explain what that means? Because in many traditions, original transcripts have been changed. And so when you say original, how original, what level of purity, in your view, are you deriving this from?
Right, it's a good question. It's important. Let's put it this way. The Zohar, what we call the Zohar, there are various editions of the Zohar and translations into various languages, but the Zohar was written in Aramaic. It's an Aramaic book, a vast book. It's usually printed in 4 volumes. And that standard edition of the Zohar is what most people consult, people who can handle or who can control the Aramaic. When I began this project of translating the Zohar about 14 years ago, I thought that I would simply begin by translating the first page of the Aramaic edition, the printed Aramaic Zohar.